Okay. We're on chapter 8, the Persian apocalyptic in Untangling Our Faith. And I think this book is Dempsey's attempt to identify all the diverse strands of belief that are in modern Christianity and trying to help us recognize what he considers to be, thinks would be prophetic and what would not be prophetic in the Bible. And I showed this here. I've condensed it a little bit more. I think this is his vision for what he's trying to accomplish overall is, as he says, to most effectively serve the magnificent dream of Zion, we must be a prophetic people. The church is...
I can't get this thing to... I've got a problem. I can't get muted.
Are you muted now?
Yeah.
Okay. The church is called to be the spark which makes the prophetic come alive in meeting the needs of people. When we become a prophetic people, the exciting promise of the prophetic should become a powerful pastoral and missionary tool of the church. So he thinks, and he wrote this 30 years ago, that if we could figure this out, we could use it effectively for the church. For nearly 2,000 years, though, Christians, and we're going to talk about the Persian detour here, Christians have thought the world was going to end in their lifetime. TV evangelists say the Bible prophesies that the times occur were in the last days. In this book by Bart Ehrman talks about a guy that, do you remember, anybody remember what happened on October, well, it started in late September 1988, October of 88.
Is that the end of the Mayan calendar?
Not that I know. There was a guy predicted the end of the world.
Nostradamus?
No,
So
I threw it out there.
I forget his name, but Miller?
no, that was in the
That was
1840s.
1840s. Oh, 1980s.
Well, they were
Was
sure
that
it
the
was
apple
gonna
guy?
end. They
The
were sure it
apple
was-
white guy?
No,
I guess you don't have it, Mark.
I didn't have it.
They were sure it was gonna end when the Mayan calendar ended too.
A guy named Edgar Wisenant. He was a rocket engineer for NASA.
Whoa.
Him, I don't remember.
Anyway, he said that during Rosh Hashanah, sometime September 11th to the 13th, Jesus Christ would return and remove his followers from the earth before the tribulation. And the tribulation would begin on October 3rd of 1988, when the Soviet Union would invade Israel and initiate World War III. Anyway,
That one
I guess we missed that because I don't remember that happening.
I don't even remember the guy.
I didn't either until I was reading this book.
I must have been busy that day.
That's like a Y2K, we're all like, what's gonna,
You know,
That or we were the ones that didn't get chosen.
I know, left
We're
behind.
still here.
I don't even like that name, left behind.
So why do you think the apocalyptic, and there were people that sold their stuff, quit their jobs, and he wasn't the first. Pearl mentioned William Miller back in 1843 predicted a certain day.
didn't he predict like 3 different times?
Well, he predicted a certain day. It didn't happen. So he said, well, and this guy did the same thing. When it didn't happen, he said, well, I forgot this one little detail. And so he recalculated and he said, it's going to be a few months further down the line. And when that didn't happen, he said, well, maybe the Gregorian calendar came into play or something like that. There was another reason. So he came up with, eventually he kind of lost
Credibility.
credibility.
And his followers.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Followers dispersed.
William Miller did the same thing when the first date rolled by and nothing happened. He said, well, I made a mistake and he made
It's
a new
like,
prediction.
it's like that when you're driving with Google, you know, it's like recalculating.
Right.
Recalculating.
I missed the recalculating. Now it's a bing.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Oh, I still have recalculating.
Anyway,
I follow it and it still bings me. I'm like, I followed what you told me to do.
so there have been people predicting the end of the world for actually over
The beginning
2,000.
of the world.
The end of the world for over 2,000 years. So why is this such a, why do people are so receptive to the end of the world message?
Maybe it's because it seems like the world around us is so involved in chaos. We think it can't get any worse. And if it does, that's it. We'll just blow up.
Well, there you go. That's one theory.
Okay.
That, and they believe all the things that says that, you know, there's gonna be earthquakes and, you know, famine and.
Yeah.
You know, that's been with us forever. So. you
So
know,
when we see an earthquake, that must mean the end of the world. The signs of times.
Well, it's like the ring of fire where they keep popping off all, you know, close together. It's not just one earthquake, it's
That's true.
the,
Yeah.
yeah,
It also is human nature to look for the negative.
Okay.
And so you're like, yeah, my world is falling apart. And here comes somebody saying, well, that's because the apocalypse is coming. And you're like, oh, that makes sense. It's not my fault. It's the world's fault.
Okay.
So we're always looking for the negative and not blaming ourselves,
yeah.
but the rest of the world.
Do you want to teach this class? You're following right. This is going to come up again. You can contribute some more.
And I'm not even writing it.
Okay. I was letting you volunteer if you wanted to, because this is going to come right in line with what we're talking about. Well, talking about apocalyptic messages, he says, Dempsey says this is the opposite of a prophetic message. And we've talked about these in previous classes. So the apocalyptic message usually involves a distant prediction. And like April just said, well, she didn't mention God, but she, you know, basically it's somebody else's fault. We assume God will do it all. We just have to trust in God. This is the end of time. Satan is to blame for the problems. And there are angelic hosts and demonic hosts roaming the world. Our only hope is that God will intervene, destroy evil, and establish a perfect society. Some of this sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the good news is that for the apocalyptic preachers, the TV evangelist, is that God revealed his plan to the prophets of old. So we know what is coming.
This is how a lot of cults get started. Because people start losing hope that God's not going to help them. Here comes somebody saying, hey, I have the solution. And then they band together and all of a sudden you're now in a cult and
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the sanctuary.
If it's a sanctuary.
I'll go tell
But the apocalyptic belief actually goes much further back than the beginning of Christianity. This is what it goes back to what Dempsey calls the Persian detour, which he thinks was in conflict with the Mosaic faith of Judah. And for Judaic, Mosaic faith in Judaism and eventually in the Christianity, this he traces it back to when the Judeans were in Babylonian captivity and what he calls the first ones that were coming out with apocalyptic predictions was proto-apocalyptic, a much milder form than the full-blown apocalyptic that happened in the 200 years before Christ. Some of the proto-apocalyptic prophets are Ezekiel, some parts of Isaiah, and Zechariah. Then he says the greatest influence came from the Persians when they conquered Babylon, who had the Judeans in captivity. They conquered Babylon in 539. And then so I'm going to ask, what is present day Iran, Persia so influential to the Judeans?
Zoroastrianism.
Okay.
They said stuff they wanted to hear.
Okay.
Well, they were more proactive. They allowed their captives to practice their own religion. They sent the
Okay.
Jews back to their homeland and helped
Eventually, yeah.
and help fund rebuild the temple.
Pretty nice guys, all in all, for being a
Conqueror.
conqueror. They're a lot better than the Babylonians.
Yeah, sorry, which people's group or nation came out of present day Iran? Well, you said Persia.
Persia is what is now present day Iran.
Yeah. Yeah,
And supposedly, I think that's where the Magi came from.
Well, everybody's getting ahead of me.
That's good.
That's true.
sorry, let me rephrase my question. How did the cultures interact with each other? The Persians,
And
the
Which other-
Judeans.
Judeans,
Mhm.
well, yeah, Jeremy's right. The Judeans were captive first to Babylon, and when Babylon was conquered by Persia, then they were captives to Persia.
Okay, that's the part I was wondering. I knew that they had gone into Babylonian captivity, but I couldn't remember that the Persians then took over.
Yeah. And so the Persians were a more benevolent dictator than the Babylonians. I'm sure it wasn't all rosy and everything, but
Oxymoron.
they did allow them, like Coral said, to practice their religion, although they greatly influenced, as we'll
Yeah.
find out. And eventually, Cyrus the Great allowed them to return to their homeland, to Judah. And actually, I'm not sure exactly how, but they let them bring back their some of their temple artifacts and help fund rebuilding of the temple. So he was, fairly benevolent, I guess you'd say. But their religion, the Persian influence came through this Zoroastrianism, and it's still alive today in some parts of Iran and India, according to Wikipedia. Zarathustra, and this is where Zoroastrian gets it. His name in Greek was Zoroaster. But he was a spiritual reformer who lived somewhere in eastern Persia, and Dempsey says he thought he lived from 630 BC when he was born to 553. Now, Wikipedia said there's all sorts of ideas when the guy lived. A lot of scholars say anywhere from 1700 BC to 600 BC. Some even go back.
Quite a range.
Well, it goes back even further than that. Some say it's thousands of years earlier than that. So it's real, but this is what Dempsey thought.
Huh.
And during Cyrus the Great's reign, part of it, he preceded him. But according to Dempsey, he was ahead of Zoroastrianism as the religion was known by a generation, but they adopted him as their prophet and spiritual founder. And then they changed some of the stuff he taught. And this is where Coral's right. He's also, according to Wikipedia again, presumed to be the founder of astrology and magic, and magi is the term for priest of Zoroastrianism. And of course, we know the story in Matthew, the wise men, the magi came from the east.
We aren't talking astrology like we do today. We're talking about how the stars.
Well, don't they get their
Well, yeah,
clues from the stars somehow?
yeah. I mean, they use the stars, but it's not like Aries today, you're gonna have this kind of day. We're talking about old.
Yeah. This is a point that Dempsey made about Zarathustra, he had more of a, he believed people should use their agency, side with the good against the evil, but the Zoroastrian theologians, he says, perverted that into a polytheistic battle between a good God and an evil God. And this led to the Judeans incorporating 5 Zoroastrian ideas into their religion. And the first one was dualism. We had a good god, Ahura Mazda, and a bad god or evil god, Angra Mainyu, in Zoroastrianism.
Who was that comedian that had the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other?
Well, it might have been Flip Wilson.
That's
Well, Flip Wilson, I don't know if he had he always just talked about the devil made me do it. I'm not sure if he had a good angel or not. I don't, but maybe he did. So Dempsey says that the monotheism of Judaism was corrupted when now they had an evil God and a good God, and the evil God they named Satan. And he says it went through some stages. First, there wasn't any hint of Satan. And notice Satan is in lowercase. And then in stage 2, there was a Satan who acted more as a prosecutor or an advisor to God. And he named 3 places where it shows up in the Old Testament. You know, we know the story about Satan, and God came up that they would test Job to see how strong his faith was, I guess. And then there was one where Joshua was tried by a divine tribunal. And then in the book, Dempsey talks about there's some scriptures. In one scripture, God incites the people against King David when he has him perform a census. And the other scripture, Satan is the one who has David perform a census, and that incites the people against him. So the scriptures, one says it's God and one says it's Satan. So, and then the final 3rd stage, Satan is now Satan with a capital S, and has become not a prosecutor or an advisor to God. He is now a demon opposed to God, and he is the source of evil, which is kind of what fits in probably with what April was saying.
I get the impression that Dempsey does not believe that Satan exists.
No, I know there's a couple of people here at least that have had experiences with evil. So Mary has mentioned it one time, I think, and Jeremy has. So a question, is evil all Satan's fault?
That is a big question.
Yeah.
If it's not God's fault, it has to be somebody's fault.
Because it can't be our fault.
Well,
Like Flip Wilson said, the devil made me do it.
Question is, who made the devil do it?
yeah, because in Job, he wasn't necessarily the evil one.
I know,
He was
I kind of
the-
like that prosecutor idea, you know?
Yeah. he
I
was
never thought
like-
of him that way.
Yeah.
It's your lawyer.
I know. I can get on board with a Satan who's a prosecutor, but
There's also the title of the Satan figure, the accuser or the opposer, you know, Hasatan. And so it wasn't always a person, but it was a role you step into as an opposer. Like, get behind me, Satan. Jesus said to Peter. He was saying, you are opposing my will. Right?
that wasn't literal. That was,
Yeah.
he's not calling Peter Satan. He's just calling him a doubter.
Well, how did evil come to be is one of those big philosophical questions we've been struggling with ever since we became conscious, I guess, as human beings.
I don't think we want to take, some of it, I think, is because we don't want to take responsibility for our own actions. But then again, I will admit to talking about the demons that used to wake me up at 2 o'clock in the morning and tell me how horrible I was and how I was going to hell and that nobody liked me and that, you know, made me just crazy.
Yeah.
And so whether that's a real demon or whether it's just my own
It's your own personal
mental-
demons.
Yeah, well, and I've called them my personal demons, but
Yeah.
you know, whether it's being mentally ill at the time or just whatever it is, whether it's a real demon or is just part of my, well, I don't know. I don't know how to even explain it.
Yeah, I just think human beings are always trying to, it's exactly what April said. We're always trying to explain something outside of ourselves instead of looking inside of ourselves. You know, it's like when psychology came to being, you know, we can explain the demons a little bit more. We can explain.
But it's like, I don't want this, so why is it coming in and getting me? That's the part, you know, I
Yeah.
struggle with. It's like, I would not choose this.
No, but I think it's just, I think our lives are just more complex than our brains. What are we using? What, 10% of our
Yeah.
brains or something like that? I don't know. I hear all those
They say
statistics.
that.
You know, and it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's a lot that we can't control inside our own brain. So we need to accept that rather than say it must be the devil, you know?
Yes, but when it keeps me awake and I
Well,
can't
you're
see the,
working on it though now.
I am.
So there you go. The devil's going away.
I mean, mental illness has definitely been blamed on devils and evil for very, very, very long time.
Yeah,
Witches and stuff like that.
yeah.
No,
Because you were possessed.
Yeah.
Or
Mhm.
of an evil
Cursed.
force.
yeah. And a lot of it was mental illness. We know that now.
Yeah.
Or it was, in the case of like the witch trials and stuff, probably a bad grain that
Mhm.
made people hallucinate. Like there's a lot of
Yeah.
physical things. And, you know, that can be blamed for the evil that we see every day. But there are some things that we can't explain, but that doesn't mean that it might be a devil, it might be Satan. It means we don't know yet. We're always learning, we're always expanding our knowledge.
Unfortunately, the women who got drowned or hung for witchcraft
Burned.
or
Didn't have a
burned,
chance.
their defense, I forget how the trial would go, but if you survived,
They,
And you were
And you're okay.
they throw them in the river. If they survived, they were a witch, and if they didn't, then they were innocent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep,
I thought it worked that way.
Death is your reward for a clean conscience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
we
uh,
found.
I agree with April in the sense that a lot of illnesses were misattributed. But for me, and we don't have time to get into this, but I do believe in demonic possession and demonic influence. The tricky thing is, how do you disentangle that from schizophrenia and other diseases?
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's very messy.
Yeah.
So, don't know.
Well, we'll present Dempsey's view. According to him, Satan gained wide acceptance in Judah because the concept of Satan saved God and humanity from responsibility for the existence of evil. So I think we've heard more than one side of this. So
Mhm.
the second point of our second idea that was incorporated in Judaism in Dempsey's view was that the gods had hosts of angels and fallen angels. And an angel early on was simply a messenger. And the Greek word angelos means angel or messenger. Now, first example of messenger actually came to me was when the angel appears to Mary, but that's in the New Testament. So back to the Old Testament, can you think of examples of an angel serving as a messenger in the Old Testament, and particularly before the Babylonian captivity? But if you come up with any, that'd be okay.
Abraham and Lot.
Story of Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay.
The two strangers that come to tell him about Lot being in trouble at Sodom. Sodom?
He told him, you better get out of town, get out of Dodge, so to speak.
Yeah.
and don't look back.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, oops.
Yeah.
Tell your wife not to look back.
I guess that message part didn't get conveyed.
Well, but it's hard not to look back.
Okay, somebody remind me,
Yeah.
in the inspired version of the Bible, do we have Satan as the fallen angel? Because I had this big argument with a guy at work one time, and I was quoting Genesis, and I thought I was, and he's like, that's not in Genesis, and I said, well, yes, it is, and we looked it up. And I'm pretty sure Satan's in there as a fallen angel in the
And
inspired
took one
version.
third of the host of angels with him.
Yeah,
go.
hosts of heaven.
There you go. I am remembering it correctly.
Yeah.
That is not in the King James.
I can't
version.
tell you where it is, but
Yeah,
but-
it's in Genesis, I can tell you that.
It's not in any other.
Dante came up with the idea first. Much of our vision of heaven and hell
Is
is
Dante's
hell
and
is from
Inferno.
Dante, who preceded Joseph Smith. That's just right.
What do you think, Joseph Smith?
Joseph Dante, the Inferno.
okay, does anybody have an example of a messenger besides Quarles? No, I'm Paul.
Well, I can't think of many in the Old Testament.
Okay, we'll move on,
Is that
and
what-
we'll,
Testing this?
I've got some,
Oh, you better.
I always pray when my kids are traveling to, send his angels to watch over them.
Who wrestled with the angel?
Jacob.
Jacob.
Thank you. I can't remember.
I don't know if he had a message, though. He wrestled with him, but
Oh, yeah, because he wanted his name and he wouldn't.
And then he was named Israel,
Israel.
meaning that those who strive or struggle with God.
yeah. But there was an angel. First, Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, and they were about to the point of him doing it, but an angel appeared and said, "Don't do it." And then he looked over and he saw this ram caught in the
Brambles.
thickles.
Correct in thinking that when Nebuchadnezzar, whoever it was, put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, that there was a fourth personage in there, and people think that was an angel.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think well,
Hmm.
I don't know what the message was, though.
Yeah, I don't know.
That you're not gonna be-
But an angel appeared.
Whatever you do, don't burn up.
Well, it's protected.
Yeah, protected them from burning up.
So
Yeah,
it's
right,
putting
there was a-
his wings
That would
around
be one of these cases at the bottom where they were a servant, I guess. Another message was when Balaam was on his donkey and the donkey stopped and he wouldn't move and he started beating the donkey, and an angel appeared and said, "Why are you beating your donkey?" And then he told him he was go to, and he said, if the donkey hadn't stopped, and I think he took a kind of went one way or the other, you'd be dead now. But thankfully, the donkey recognized the angel before Balaam did.
Now, was he the talking donkey?
Yes.
He was
That
the
talking
donkey also said,
That's what I thought too. It's like, that's the talking donkey.
so he told him he was supposed to go to King Balak, and the angel would tell him what he was supposed to say. So then there's another story. An angel told this woman, Manoah, she would have a son. She named him Samson, who was a Nazirite to God. And then there are stories where the angels aren't messengers, but they're servants. And there's the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, God places a cherubim or an angel to guard the east entrance so they can't get back in. And I didn't remember this. I remember in Exodus, I always think that God led them by a pillar of fire and a cloud.
Yeah.
But there was also an angel who went in front of them to guard the way to the promised land. So that was acting as a servant rather than a messenger. Now, Dempsey says angels were unknown to the classical prophets, but I thought, well, what about, first thing that came to my mind, I didn't really research this, but in Isaiah's vision where he sees the seraphim, who are angels hovering above God, well, I thought we considered at least parts of Isaiah, according to Jonathan last week, that parts of Isaiah were classical prophet and some parts. So I thought this was in the classical part. It's early on. So I was kind of like, well, was Dempsey right there? The angels were unknown to the classical prophets. Anybody else think of another classical prophet that had an angel?
Well, to be specific, Dempsey says that that first part of Isaiah is written by the historical prophet, but with some modifications by later writers.
Okay.
So
So you had an editor.
Yeah. Who didn't ask permission.
Right.
So maybe that's how the seraphim got in there.
it could be.
I don't know. Okay. Like I said, I didn't research that, but that popped in my mind. I thought, well, maybe there's some other cases.
An angel appeared to the guy and said, put me in that.
Yeah.
He forgot about this.
Left out. Can you put me in there?
Yeah, Isaiah
So why
forgot
does-
about me.
So why does Dempsey think that these heavenly hosts and angels are inconsistent with the Mosaic faith and the theology of the prophets?
Well, I guess because if you're going to emphasize one God, you shouldn't be having all these other supernatural beings.
Yeah, but they're not gods. They're a lower level.
I don't know, it's starting to get kind of pagan where you have different gods at different levels that have different responsibilities
Okay.
and powers.
So,
You know, that's a
Okay.
viewpoint, I
Yeah.
think, that some people would say this is moving away from monotheism.
Well, and Islam always considers Christianity to be polytheistic because of God and the Holy Spirit, because he doesn't need helpers. But in the Quran, they also have angels like Gabriel and
yeah,
they have a jinn who isn't necessarily Satan, but is maybe the Satan with the lowercase s.
okay.
So I'm not sure how that all works.
Lowercase g.
No,
Yes, for
no,
the
S
evil.
for Satan.
Well, she called him Jinn though.
Yeah, well, that's what they call him in Islam.
I was-
J.
J. Okay,
J.
J. I'm just.
Which is where
G.
genie comes from.
Gin and tonic.
Well, it's.
Okay,
for-
J-I-N. Okay, I didn't know.
J. Yeah.
You know, the human family has been polytheistic far longer than we've been, tried to be monotheistic.
Yeah.
Right.
And even in the time of Israel, when they were trying to embrace a monotheistic view of God, they were still surrounded by other countries who were much more powerful than they were that were
Yeah.
polytheistic. And so the pressure was tremendous to kind of keep bringing that into your theology.
Yeah.
And, you know, even in Christianity, I mean, some people would disagree with this, but I think it's true that the notion of the Trinity is really a polytheistic aberration of the notion of one true God.
Well, and that's what Islam says, because God doesn't need any helpers.
Well, yeah, our study of the history of Christianity is that was their debate for the first 100 or so years is are we going to
Some
believe in
people
the
are-
3 in 1? How do we do this? You know?
Hard and fast Trinitarians, and we'll never think otherwise, but, you know, to me, it's just a human nature to want more gods on your side than just the one, I guess. Maybe we want a bigger team.
So your original question, Dennis, was how does this differ from,
How's it inconsistent with Mosaic faith and theology of the prophets? But you can answer any of those questions I got up there. And it all kind of ties together. You know, the next part is during the Persian detour, Zoroastrianism had this theophany of angels and supernatural beings. And eventually the Judeans thought that you had to have these for God, you know, God had to have helpers evidently. And so you can answer the last question. Do you think they are vital to God's work in the world now? Or if you want to talk about the other question, either one, they all works together.
yeah, I kind of get what he's saying, but I disagree that, well, you could say that angels, a theology that includes angels puts some responsibility off of you and puts it on angels. Or you could argue that God doesn't need help, but then again, why did he create humans? Or, you know, well, if he doesn't need us, then why are we here? I don't know. It's, that's,
What was that, Jeremy?
And we're here to keep them amused.
Here to keep God amused. Okay.
Well, and that's what some religions kind of believe.
Yeah.
Oh, because some of the African religions, well, it's not necessarily, they have their own personal tribal gods, but your ancestors are also sort of up there, and if you don't keep them happy, they can cause you mischief. So if you don't give them food or treat them well, then they can mess with your life.
Okay. I don't have any knowledge of that, so I'll take your word for it.
Well, the tribal religions were still very prevalent in Africa up until the last century, and now Christianity is
Yeah,
kind of taken over as the new religion. But I know from talking with African friends, especially their parents, that were very much embedded in the idea of polytheistic tribal theologies. It's very difficult to give up just because Christianity comes in and
Right.
Yeah.
you say, yes, I embrace this. One of my friends who was very frustrated, his father still follows the tribal ways, and he's tried for years to, get him away from that, but he just can't.
so does he try to, well, and I can't remember which, there were like 3 or 4 different tribes that they were talking about, and I can't remember the names of them, but
Well, go ahead.
My nephew had a mission in Madagascar, and he told me that the hardest thing for him to teach, and this was 5 years ago, the hardest thing for them to teach was that they needed to believe in Jesus, not just an additional, not just an additional God for them to follow, but as exclusive. That was the part where they got resistance from they were going into these tribes that were not part of modern civilization. And so they had that resistance just 5 years ago.
well, when I took the class, I think the evangelicals are the fastest growing religion sect
Oh,
of
yeah.
Christianity that's growing in Africa.
Oh, yeah, that's what their
So-
job is.
So-
For years, the American people, tried to drive the beliefs from the American Indians. Yeah.
Oh, what do you mean tried?
Stole-
We did a pretty good
took
job
their
of it.
kids
Yeah.
and Pounded the.
Oh, yeah. They
Yeah.
stole
stuff
their
into
children.
brain.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Stole their,
The third idea from Zoroastrianism was that the belief that we're predestined, there's highly structured dispensations of history that were revealed to the revelators. So they had this concept of good God, the bad God, Ahura Mazda, and Angra Mainyu. They were fighting it out, and there were like 4 3,000-year periods, and one or the other would dominate it, and eventually the other one would overthrow them, and they would dominate. And in the time of the Babylonian captivity for the Judeans, the Persians thought they were in the last 3,000-year period, that this was the final one, and that their good God, the Ahura Mazda, was going to prevail. But in contrast, classical prophets don't think history is predestined, that there is these dispensations that are predestined, and the future is an open book. And then how it goes, now I don't know if did anybody look at the charts?
yeah.
I did.
These charts 13 and 14 show how Dempsey tried to represent it symbolically. So in this one, you see here's history going on chart 13, history goes down, and then you hit this certain period, and then you have this rapture, and then you have millennium. That's all predestined. Then on 14, he shows that we're proceeding through life, and you hit a decision point. Well, if you decide to go left or go one way, this is the consequence. You go the other way, here's where you end up. And then you keep hitting these decision points, and there's a variety of outcomes as time goes by. So it's an open book depending on how people respond to the situation. So,
Sorry, I was gonna say, at least in chart 14, you can change your direction.
right. Well, that's the whole point. Every time you hit a decision point, you're going to go one direction or another. And there might even be more than 2 options. You might have several
Yeah.
in this chart. That's what he said. So if classical prophets are right, it's an open book. What's the role of the prophet regarding the future?
Guide,
Guide.
give you, an example of what you should do rather than make the wrong decision.
Help you maybe look at the consequences of each decision.
Yeah. And,
Okay.
and you can prophesy with a lot of conditional statements. So rather than saying this will happen, you could say, if you do not stop this, this will likely happen. If, however, we go this route, this will likely happen. So,
And wasn't that what the classical prophets did with, they might tell a king, if you don't do this,
mhm.
you're going to be conquered if you want to join up with this guy. And if you do something else, well, different
It's more
consequences.
about common sense,
Yeah.
they were predicting things, but based on their observations, what should have been fairly obvious to the people and wasn't, as opposed to somebody like Nostradamus who's saying in 2024, this is going to happen or something like that. That's a different type of prophecy. And I think the type of prophecy that the classical prophets, were an example of, were the ones that just were stating the obvious, really.
Except to the king, obvious except for the guy.
I do think that Dempsey makes an artificial argument when he separates prophets into classical or pre-classical or otherwise, because I think it's like anybody has a good day and a bad day. When the prophet deals with common sense issues and common morality and tries to provide guidance, that's a classical prophet. But some of the people he identifies as classical have also made prophecies that don't fall in that category. So I think it's a educational, theological classification that works for him, but is not 100% clear cut.
Well, I think he recognized that you can be a classical prophet and sometimes and you could be proto-apocalyptic or a full-blown apocalyptic other times. Some of these guys were not. I think Ezekiel was one example where some of the time he was prophetic classically, but other times he wasn't.
Yeah.
So I think he may simplify it somewhat in his explanation, but I think he recognized that you weren't always just in one slot. You weren't nailed down to being always classical or not.
It's very visionary, Ezekiel was.
Yeah. So, did you hear that, Jeremy?
I think so.
Okay.
Safe to say there's no absolutes, I don't.
Yes.
Now, when you scoot up closer, Paul, I think might help people hear you better. I'm not sure Karen's hearing what Paul says.
And I'm always very slow in
Yeah.
my comments.
We're hearing Paul.
Okay.
I'll speak up. Is that better?
Yeah. Jonathan
What?
and Jeremy, I have a little trouble with.
Yeah.
Well, they're,
They have something.
yeah, as usual. My point is, sometimes my comments are minutes later and they're probably out of context, but when you're talking about angels and devils and angel on one shoulder, devil on the other, and you're talking about ancestors, coming and doing mischief and all, what runs through my mind is some of the studies I've read where we all have tape recorders in our heads that keep replaying and replaying and replaying things that have happened to us, much of it from our parents. And so when I am in a difficult situation, the first thing I hear is this too shall pass. And that's something my mother would say. And when things go wrong, I see, who cares? And that goes through my head. And I think that's because I've heard that somewhere, that when things are going bad, you just figure in 100 years, who cares? So my point is, I think I believe there are mental illnesses. I believe that our brains are wired differently. I can tell that from looking at my two daughters. We are just so different. I don't personally believe in a Satan, but I do believe that we create our own evil. It didn't take God to create it. We can do it all on our own.
Okay,
And I think we can create our own angels. And when we talk about angels, the time that I think about angels the most is that we are, in fact, the angels for other people.
okay.
It doesn't take a supernatural being
That's nice.
to make the world better. All it does is for us to act to be our best people and angels for others. So that's what I've been thinking all morning.
Well,
So-
Johnny, I thought it was Johnny Carson that also said this too shall pass.
Yes.
Oh, he's an
Well-
angel.
My mother must have picked it up from Donnie.
You got Johnny Carson on your shoulder.
That from his, I was gonna say that when you were saying about us being other people's angels, I do see that something similar to that on Facebook that I posted and passed around.
And I went to a seminar one time and they were talking about the tapes and,
geez.
don't keep playing the tapes that put you down.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah. But you know, it's really hard to stop.
Oh,
them.
yeah.
So,
Hopefully it's
Stuck
2 o'clock in
on
the morning.
It takes a lifetime. It takes a
Okay.
lifetime to stop.
But I remember as a kid seeing a cartoon where they had an angel and a devil on
Yeah.
each shoulder.
that's quite often, yeah.
So,
Or
So-
Jimmy Cricket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, isn't that kind of like where, you know, you're wrestling with the pros and cons of what you're.
Sort of, that's
options
a representation, I would think,
Yeah.
right on there.
Mhm.
So the Judeans found Zoroastrianism reassuring when they were under Persia's rule, because somebody was in control. They thought God was in control. The future was in God's hands. A fourth point was a new age is coming. Zoroastrians thought they were in the final dispensation. And does this sound familiar? The good God would send the world redeemer to purge the world of evil and usher in a new age of righteousness and peace. On the other hand, here, the Judean belief before Persian rule was that there would be a Messiah who would restore the kingdom of David to its former glory. More of a nationalistic thought, because it didn't include the end of, or at least early on, didn't include the end of the world, the purging of evil, the new age of righteousness. But then later on, those did come in. For a fifth point was the dead will be resurrected and judged. The dead would be raised, subjected to judgment fire. I thought this was interesting. The good people would get through safely. The evil people, they would have all the evil things burned out of them, more or less, traces of evil. They would suffer, but they would come through. Versus, what would you say,
Burn
Christian
forever.
belief?
Burn forever.
Burn forever, yes.
Okay, for you.
Yeah,
A
well,
little more optimistic, I would.
Yeah.
Zoroastrianism, they didn't put you in,
Hell.
yeah, well, or eternal
Purgatory or-
burning.
yeah.
Eternal damnation, yes.
Although fire was a big thing in is a big thing in
So
Zoroastrianism.
here's the,
Because, well, before you move on, you know, that purging would line up with the Catholic belief of purgatory. Purgation, in their belief, is you're not destined for hell, but to be made righteous, you need to go through a purification
is
process.
that the way it is? Alex?
Yeah, I still think everybody comes up with their own little story.
well, I was taught as a kid that, you know, when you died, that you were, if you didn't know Jesus, you were given an opportunity to
Mhm.
learn
Yeah.
of him.
Yeah.
you know.
That's Joseph Smith. Joseph
Yeah.
Smith taught us
Yeah.
that. And I got a big argument with the Baptist on that too. I'm like, what are you talking about? We got plenty of time.
In the Judean, in contrast to Zoroastrian, Judeans, according to Dempsey, went back to the scripture, the secret things belong to our Lord, our God, but only the things that are revealed belong to us. So they had this idea that they really didn't say much about the hereafter, pre-Persia influence. They just were interested in the world that they knew about, that was, Dempsey says, was revealed to them. So which one sounds, whoops,
You're flipping around here. What am I supposed to be looking at?
well, this thing is real sensitive. Okay, good.
There you go.
So the Zoroastrianism, at least the way in the simplified view Dempsey presents, sounds a little bit more like Christianity's. view than early Judah does, isn't it?
Well, my ex still believes that once you're dead, you're dead. He's Jewish,
Well,
although he's his own sort of Jewish believer.
okay. Well, that's,
But he believes that there is, once you're dead, that's it, you're dead.
yeah.
Hmm.
Okay,
Well, that was the belief of the Sadducees
Yeah,
Yeah.
in
so maybe
first century.
he's channeling Sadducees.
so the Persian apocalyptics were optimistic, and they probably had a right to be. Persia was the greatest power in the world at that time. History was on their side. Things were looking up. They were taking over the world, The Jewish apocalyptics, they were kind of pessimistic. They've been subjugated for centuries by all these people. History was against them, and wouldn't you think the same thing?
Yeah. That's a good point.
So, depending on where you were, I could see how you take one view or the other. If I'd been a Jew back then, I probably said, I'm
We're here
doomed.
We're here to suffer.
Well, you
Well,
do kind of pick what speaks to your situation. I'm thinking of African Americans who many became Christian, but they really had a connection with the Old Testament and the story of people coming out of Egypt and
Yeah.
Moses, because that was their situation. They were subjugated.
That gave them hope that
That
they
gave them
could get
hope
free
Yeah.
Their
eventually.
situation would change eventually.
So the Zoroastrianism traced teachings back to Zarathustra, although they altered them. Jewish apocalypticism used these. They had presumed writings of Enoch, Moses, Ezra, but somebody else actually wrote. The scholars say wrote those apocalyptic scriptures. So what was the point of saying somebody else wrote it? Why would you do that?
Credibility.
Credibility. Would it also, perhaps the fact of somebody else that was a revered leader in the past had said it, wouldn't that
Well, if Moses
give
said it,
credibility and give you more of a hope that it actually was true?
well, if Moses said it, it must be true.
So Dempsey talks about the theological content that was influenced by the Zoroastrianism in Judaism and Christianity. And then he talks again about apocalypticism doesn't really have a rational process whereby they make their predictions. And he says this wishful thinking of the priestly and salvation strands intensified in the Persian period. Well, why would it intensify? There was a desperate need for encouragement to the Judeans. They were captive, had been for a long time. And again, it frees the non-classical prophets, I guess I would say, from the realism that classical prophecy demanded, and they could paint this rosy picture of what the future had, which would give you some, things will get better. And then the Sadducees, they didn't agree with the Persian detour. They were really, according to Dempsey, real pure monotheist. And this dualism was anathema to them. They hated it. So I thought, you read the New Testament, you never get a positive vibe out of the Sadducees in the New Testament. Wasn't this a kind of a positive light on the Sadducees? At least I thought it was.
I thought it was.
I don't know. And it depends on if you agree with that worldview.
With the monotheism?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, in fact, I think the Pharisees also get a little bit of a bad rap.
Mhm.
Not that, I think Jesus had reasons to criticize, but
So you're saying that Jesus criticizes all the organized religion of that time.
Yeah, basically,
well,
or I'd say,
he's more You'd be more qualified to criticize than I would. Yeah.
A diplomatic response there. Okay, so Dempsey talks about the legacy of the apocalyptic today. By the time of Jesus, we're talking about Jesus now, by the time of Jesus, apocalyptic teachings were widely accepted. And he says in the period 200 years before Jesus to 200 years after, there was a lot of apocalyptic books written. And so did Jesus espouse apocalyptic beliefs?
My father's house, many mansions,
Yeah.
which would be possibly apocalyptic.
Well, didn't he say something about when the Son of Man returns
Yeah,
at his trial before Pilate? You know, this is going to happen.
yes.
So here, Bart Ehrman says Jesus, apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium. So he talked all about how Jesus was apocalyptic.
Don't we go back to, I keep thinking of looking at it from a Pauline standpoint versus, Petrine.
Petrine, yeah.
Because it's what I remember the most about that book was that the Pauline says that Jesus said, this is going to be the kingdom. And the Petrines said, we are already
is-
here in the kingdom.
It's here.
So you can read Jesus's words both ways,
Who won out?
the Paulines.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is the church according to Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Christianity is.
Yeah, that's why we're.
It's another case of the winners write history.
Yeah.
Well, there are two books in our Bible that are most powerfully apocalyptic. There's apocalypticism in other books, but particularly in Daniel in the Old Testament and Revelation in the New Testament, you get this. It's almost entirely apocalyptic, I would say. And modern Christians use these two books to support apocalyptic worldview. Even when there are other scriptures that have a prophetic stand that refute that view. So what are the consequences of an apocalyptic view?
Well,
You keep getting it wrong.
Well, the apocalyptic view, in my opinion, can lead people to think it's predestined, there's nothing I can do, I just must wait for God to do it. And I don't like that passive approach to life. I
Well,
mean, I think we're supposed to be actively engaged
yeah,
in doing good or interacting with people in a righteous way or whatever, and not just not waiting for cataclysm and God will
Yeah.
take care of it.
That's what Friedrich Nietzsche said, the philosopher.
Mhm.
He wrote a book called Also Sprach Zarathustra, which later became music.
Mhm.
We just look about
Yeah,
that.
we were talking about that for that.
Yeah,
a rock and roll song.
Okay.
Elvis, yeah. So Elvis, I think, had something.
Oh, we needed Paul.
But
But anyhow, not to digress.
But I mean, the whole point was he saw Zarathustra, Nietzsche did, as his arch enemy for exactly that reason, because, religion is what people look to find meaning in life. And Nietzsche's philosophy was we create our own meaning in our lives. So he perceived that as a conflict that we have to deal with.
I agree with what you two said, but I also see it as pounding into us little people saying, now, if you don't get right, then this is what's going to happen to you.
That's what I was gonna say is
Me too.
with the apocalyptic
Yeah.
stories and stuff, it's way for religion to be like, hey, change your ways or else.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tries to guilt
trip.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's kind of, hey, look at where your decisions are taking you. If you don't change, this apocalypse, the event is gonna happen and everybody's gonna die.
Yeah, have you been saved?
Yeah,
That's the
right.
question.
Oh, yeah.
You're
Well,
not
It's just
saved.
kind of a guidance of,
and the one thing I remember reading in the book is some mother scolding her child for picking on their sibling, saying that's going to be counted against you. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's
Yeah.
really,
It still happens. It
yeah,
still
I know.
happens.
But I mean, it's like, No wonder I always thought I was going to hell because, you know, every little thing you do wrong is going to count against you.
Mhm.
Well, I'm gonna have to wrap this up. That here's some of the apocalyptic ideas that those books present, and he lists all of those. I think we've talked about several of them. Some of them we briefly hit. So I'm not going to ask response here, but any of these apocalyptic ideas fit in your belief system?
Well, Judgment Day, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot, several of them, I don't have, I don't know. Really, I don't even know for absolute certainty there's a judgment, but I feel like if there is such thing as objective justice in the world, if there is right and wrong, or if our actions do have a moral substance, there needs to be a judgment
Mhm.
at some point, whether it will be a moment or a process. Because I think we may disagree on what's right and wrong, but I think most people agree, unless you're a sociopath, that there is right and wrong. And so,
Would you agree with which would you like for judgment? Zarathustra's approach where the bad things that people do are kind of burned
Yeah,
out
fire will cleanse you.
versus, okay, you live this finite life for 70 plus years or whatever, 100 years. But then in Christian belief, you're forever over here. At least a lot of Christians believe it.
Yeah.
After this finite life, that you have an infinite period of time that you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
Which would you go for in that case? Zarathustra's look kind of appealing to me.
You can also have the Buddha approach where
Yeah.
whatever you choose in this life will affect your next life.
And then you have to work to get it out in your next
Yeah.
life.
I'm still recovering from my
Yeah.
RLDS belief that,
Did you find that?
that I was
I
gonna
didn't
have
look
to
it up.
figure out which heaven to go to, you know, I mean, which one
Yep.
to aim for.
Yeah.
Paul mentioned there's somewhere in scripture it talks about the refiner's fire. That sounds like a Zarathustra. idea.
Yeah.
What I always thought growing up in my mind was that, you know, like you said, every little thing against you. I always pictured God having like a library catalog.
Yeah.
And got all these little cards in there that, you know,
Added them up.
everything
Yep,
that I've
then you're gonna have a little
been-
movie.
done wrong, you pull out
Yeah.
one and, okay, what about this day?
Yeah.
What about this day?
Okay.
Yeah, that's in Malachi. It's the fire doesn't destroy the metal, but it causes the impurities to rise to the top so they can be removed.
Sure sound like Zarathustra.
That sure
Well,
does.
we're going to have to stop there. We're already over. Next week, Jane's going to be on chapter
Not
9.
me,
Is that right?
no,
No?
I've switched.
It's Jonathan next week.
Jonathan?
Next week you deal with a split personality. I will.
Oh.
Deal with it.
Chapter 9, What Still Stands, and this is the first chapter in part 3.